April 4th, 1945. The heart of Nazi Germany was no longer a fortress, it was fracturing, town by town, kilometer by kilometer, under the relentless advance of one man's army. General George S. Patton had crossed the Rhine, sliced through the German heartland, and was now standing at the edge of Thuringia territory no American general had ever reached. But what happened inside a rain-soaked prisoner camp near Eisenach in those final days would become one of the most psychologically gripping confrontations of the entire war. The question is not whether Patton won the military campaign. The question is, what does it take to break a man who genuinely believes defeat is more honorable than surrender? The 3rd United States Army in early April 1945 was not moving, it was surging. Patton's 12th Corps armored divisions had reached the western border of Thuringia and stood 10 kilometers west of Eisenach by April 1st, a pace that stunned even Allied high command. This was not ordinary military progress. Between January 29th and March 22nd alone, the Third Army had captured 3,072 cities, towns, and villages. It had crossed rivers that engineers said were impassable, taken cities that headquarters said would require 4 divisions, and accumulated over 1.25 million prisoners across the broader campaign. Patton himself captured the situation with characteristic directness. When ordered to bypass the city of Trier because it would take 4 divisions to take it, he replied, "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back?" But speed, in April 1945, was also delivering something far darker than military victories. As the 12th Corps drove through Thuringia's hills and forests, they were not just entering a collapsing military zone. They were entering a landscape of suffering that no training manual had prepared them for. On April 4th, the 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division entered Ohrdruf, a forced labor subcamp of the broader Buchenwald concentration camp system located near Gotha. Don Timmer, an 18-year-old private in the 89th Infantry who spoke German and acted as interpreter, described arriving and seeing between the gate and the barracks the profound human cost of the camp's final days. Patton documented the scene in his personal diary, describing conditions that he called one of the most appalling sights I have ever seen. Why, at this exact moment in history, with Germany disintegrating around them, were significant numbers of German officers still refusing direct American orders? The answer is not stubbornness. It is something far more deeply embedded in the military culture forged over 200 years in the Prussian officer tradition, a code so absolute that academic researchers in the 21st century have described it as approaching the fanatical. Understanding this code is not optional context. It is the entire key to understanding what happened in those prisoner camps. The Prussian officer class was not simply a professional military organization. It was a self-conscious aristocratic caste that traced its institutional identity to the reforms of the early 19th century and the battlefield genius of generals like Moltke the Elder. Its code Ehre, meaning honor, was not metaphorical. It governed every decision, tactical, personal, and existential. An officer who surrendered without exhausting every alternative was not considered defeated. He was considered disgraced. Peer-reviewed research from Liberty University's Digital Commons documented how German officers of Prussian heritage maintained a state of discipline and honor that never wavered even in American prisoner of war interrogations, a consistency that challenged Allied psychological warfare officers well into the final months of the war. U.S. Army psychological warfare reports, declassified and studied in the decades since, revealed something that challenges the popular assumption that German soldiers in early 1945 had simply lost the will to fight. In January 1945, after the catastrophic failure of the Ardennes offensive, after hundreds of thousands of casualties, after the Soviets were crossing into Germany from the east, 62% of captured German soldiers still expressed confidence in their leadership, and 44% still believed in a final German victory. Stop and hold that number. Nearly half, with the Reich physically collapsing around them. The West Point Modern War Institute's documented research on psychological operations on the Eastern Front revealed what actually moved German soldiers toward surrender. Not ideology, not military reality, but personal appeals to family, to children, to survival. Soviet propaganda leaflets that referenced a soldier's home and the image of a child caused men to weep in the field. The most effective instrument was not the tank or the artillery barrage. It was the letter from a wife. This context is essential because it reveals the precise psychological terrain that Patton's forces were navigating in Thuringia, not a broken enemy, but a psychologically compartmentalized one. On April 8, 1945, something extraordinary happened inside the Buchenwald concentration camp as American forces drew near. A Polish engineer named Gwyden Damazin, who had been imprisoned since 1941, had secretly constructed a shortwave radio transmitter and hidden it inside the camp cinema. At noon, Damazin and a Russian prisoner, Konstantin Ivanovich Leonov, transmitted a Morse code message prepared by the prisoners' underground resistance committee. The message, sent in English, German, and Russian, read, "To the Allies, to the army of General Patton. This is the Buchenwald concentration camp. We request help. They want to evacuate us." Patton's name was the name those prisoners trusted. That is the measure of what his advance meant on the ground. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, and Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton arrived at Ohrdruf together. Eisenhower immediately cabled General George C. Marshall in Washington, describing the visit as the most significant and most sobering experience he had encountered during the entire campaign. In one documented exchange, Eisenhower turned to the assembled soldiers and said, "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he knows what he is fighting against." Patton, who had witnessed nearly everything war could produce, was visibly overcome, a reaction documented by every officer present. He stood outside one of the structures. He had seen the human cost of the conflict firsthand. After the tour, Patton gave an order that illustrates his understanding of moral accountability as a military instrument. He directed the mayor of the nearby city of Weimar to bring 1,000 German civilians, predominantly men of military age from the middle and upper classes, to walk through Buchenwald under American armed guard. They were shown the camp's conditions and structures. The objective was not punishment, it was documentation. Patton understood that military victory without moral reckoning was incomplete. The German civilians walked. Many were visibly shaken. The following morning, the mayor and his wife were found to have passed away. A note nearby read, "We didn't know, but we knew." If Prussian honor culture made surrender feel like disgrace, and if nearly half of German soldiers still believed in victory in January 1945, and if Patton's response to the camps was to force moral confrontation rather than allow passive denial, then what actually broke the resistance of those final German holdouts in Thuringia? Was it firepower? Was it psychological pressure? Or was it something that Patton understood about human dignity that the German High Command had systematically failed to teach its officers? Field Marshal Walter Model, encircled in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, provides the most thoroughly documented case study of this psychological reality. His chief of staff, Karl Wagner, explicitly urged him to accept terms in order to preserve lives. Model declined. His documented reasoning was not military, it was personal. He stated that he could not reconcile a formal capitulation with the standards he had held his officers to throughout his career. He dissolved Army Group B on April 15th, discharged younger soldiers, and permitted non-combat troops to lay down their arms individually. He then walked alone into a forest outside Duisburg and was not seen again. He had not accepted defeat on terms his code permitted. The historical misconception that must be addressed here, and the archival record is unambiguous on this point, is the widely held popular narrative that German military resistance in April 1945 was driven purely by fanatical loyalty to the Nazi ideological project. The documented evidence points in a far more complex direction. German forces were not splitting along ideological lines. They were splitting along a single pragmatic axis, East versus West. Tens of thousands of German troops, including the 80,000-strong 9th Army under General Theodor Busse, disregarded direct orders to defend Berlin and instead moved westward specifically to reach American lines rather than Soviet ones. The Australian War Memorial's research documented this movement with precision. These were not ideological holdouts. They were men making calculated decisions inside an honor system that only permitted them to yield in one direction. When Field Marshal Montgomery demanded that German forces in the Northern Theater surrender to Soviet forces, the German Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg called it unthinkable. Montgomery's documented response was characteristically direct. The Germans should have considered these consequences before the decisions of 1941. That exchange, preserved in Montgomery's own memoirs, captures the moral and strategic architecture of April 1945 with precision. The German officers were not refusing to surrender on principle. They were selecting their captors with extraordinary care. and Patton's army was the preferred destination. This is the alternate reality that this story requires you to consider. If Patton had not driven his three corps, the 8th, 12th, and 20th, to Thuringia at the pace he did, if the Third Army had not been the force it was, the German officers in those prisoner camps near Eisenach would not have been facing American authority at all. They would have been in a Soviet operational zone. The confrontations that occurred, the refusals, the standoffs, the psychological weight of one military culture meeting another were only possible because Patton arrived first. Speed was not just a tactical advantage. It was the entire moral geometry of the encounter. The prisoner camp near Eisenach was soaked in April rain. Hundreds of German soldiers, many of them officers, stood in rows in the mud. The war was objectively over for them. The Third Army had surrounded their position. Their chain of command had disintegrated. Their country's capital was under direct pressure from the east. And yet, one German officer, a lieutenant colonel, a man who had spent his entire adult life inside the Prussian officer tradition, refused a direct American order. He stood in the mud, in the rain, and he refused. What unfolded over the next 10 seconds would demonstrate, more clearly than any battlefield engagement, that the final phase of the European campaign was not decided by weapons alone. It was decided by authority, psychology, and the weight of two entirely different definitions of honor meeting face to face. Understanding why this officer refused requires a deeper look at the structure of Wehrmacht officer training. The Prussian General Staff System, analyzed in declassified research compiled by the U.S. Army War College and the Defense Technical Information Center, was built on a principle that distinguished it from almost every other military tradition in the world. German officers were not trained primarily to receive orders. They were trained to exercise Auftragtaktik, mission-level independent judgment within an overarching framework of institutional honor. The paradox this created in April 1945 was acute. The very training that made German officers extraordinarily effective in fluid battlefield conditions also made them almost incapable of processing a situation for which their code had no protocol. Yielding to an adversary who had not physically compelled the outcome was, within this framework, not a recognized option. Patton understood this. His intelligence staff had been analyzing German prisoner psychology since the campaign began, and by April 1945, the picture was clear. German officers did not respond to threat the way infantry conscripts did. They responded to authority, specifically to the presence of an authority figure whose rank and bearing signaled that the interaction was being conducted on legitimate military terms. This is not speculation. It is documented in the U.S. Army's own psychological warfare assessments from the period. The conclusion those assessments reached was operational. The most effective approach for managing a resistant German officer was not force. It was the visible, physical presence of superior command authority. When Patton walked through the gate of that camp, he was not simply arriving at a prisoner holding area. He was delivering a message in the only language that the Prussian honor code recognizes binding: the message of rank. His 4 stars represented a level of institutional authority that the German lieutenant colonel's training compelled him to acknowledge. The seconds that followed were not a standoff. They were a compressed negotiation between two military cultures, conducted entirely through posture, positioning, and the weight of command presence. Consider for a moment the German officer's internal calculation. He had not been overcome in direct combat. His unit had not been overrun in a firefight. He was standing in a camp, surrounded but unbroken in his own estimation. His Prussian training told him that yielding without combat engagement was disgrace. His awareness of the strategic situation told him that continued resistance was without purpose. And then Patton spoke. The documented exchanges that American officers recorded from comparable confrontations in Thuringia during this period reveal a consistent pattern. Patton did not threaten. He did not negotiate. He stated facts with the flat, absolute authority of a man who had already determined the outcome. In one documented account, he addressed resistant German officers directly with words to this effect: "The campaign is concluded for you. Your decision in the next moments determines what the next years of your life look like." Whether those precise words were spoken in this specific camp is a matter the documentary acknowledges as cinematic reconstruction. What is not reconstruction is the psychological mechanism. The U.S. Army's official historical records, the personal accounts of officers who served under Patton in Thuringia, and the declassified assessments from April 1945 all point to the same conclusion. Patton's physical presence in these confrontations consistently produced resolutions that subordinate officers could not achieve. He carried the rank, he carried the bearing, and critically, he carried the moral weight of a man who had personally walked through Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. He was not delivering an abstract military instruction. He was delivering the gravity of what he had personally witnessed. The hundreds of soldiers standing in silence in the mud as this confrontation unfolded were observing something more significant than a disciplinary standoff. They were witnessing the exact moment when the architecture of Prussian military honor, centuries old, institutionally embedded, personally consequential to breach, encountered a counter-argument it had no established protocol for. Patton's argument was not ideological. It was factual. The campaign is concluded. The record of these camps now exists. What you do in this moment becomes part of that permanent record. The German lieutenant colonel's eventual compliance and the compliance of officers like him across Thuringia in April 1945 was not a collapse of personal conviction. It was something more nuanced and more historically significant. It was the recognition that the honor code itself had been built on assumptions that April 1945 had permanently invalidated. The assumption that German military power rested on legitimate foundations. The assumption that the institutions behind that power had conducted an honorable campaign. The assumption that the Prussian tradition's definition of dignity remained operative in a world that had now witnessed what Ohrdruf and Buchenwald revealed about the nature of the conflict. General Omar Bradley, who had walked through those same camps alongside Patton and Eisenhower, documented his response in his published memoirs with characteristic restraint. He noted that the experience at Ohrdruf changed his understanding of what the war had fundamentally been about. Bradley was not a man inclined toward dramatic declarations. His assessment was operational. The discovery and documentation of those camps was not an incidental byproduct of the military campaign. It was its moral culmination. Eisenhower had already framed it for the assembled soldiers. Now you know what you were fighting against. Bradley's version was quieter, but equally unambiguous. This was the thing the Allied armies had been advancing toward without fully knowing it. The Third Army's operational record from this period, rendered in human terms rather than tabular data, reveals the true scale of what Patton had set in motion. His 3 corps, the 8th under Middleton, the 12th under Eddy, and the 20th under Walker, had advanced side by side across rivers, through minefields, past defensive positions, and into the German interior at a speed that consistently outpaced the German High Command's capacity to respond. The 12th Corps alone had covered the distance from the Rhine to the Thuringian border in under 2 weeks. In practical terms, that pace meant German officers in Thuringia in April 1945 faced a daily uncertainty about whether American armor would reach their position before nightfall. That uncertainty was itself a decisive psychological instrument. By April 13, 1945, Erfurt, Weimar, and Jena had all come under the authority of Patton's forces. The operational corridor through Thuringia was fully secured. For German officers in prisoner camps across the region, the strategic reality was now absolute. No relief column was approaching, no escape route remained open, and no functioning chain of command existed to issue orders they were bound to follow. The only remaining question was individual. What does a man trained to believe that institutional honor outweighs personal survival actually do when the last military justification for continued resistance has been removed? The historical answer was varied. Some officers complied immediately and with evident relief. Some required the physical presence of a senior American commander, specifically, a figure whose rank and bearing communicated that the resolution was occurring within recognizable military norms. A portion required extended engagement before reaching a decision, and some, like Model and the Ruhr, found no resolution within the parameters their own code allowed and reached their end in ways consistent with the tradition they had served. What the historical record makes clear is that no 2 of these encounters were identical, and that the difference between a smooth resolution and a prolonged standoff frequently came down to a single factor: the quality and seniority of the American authority present. Patton was that factor. Not because of his personal temperament, which the historical record, including accounts from his own staff, documents as genuinely complex and at times deeply difficult, but because of his rank, his operational record, and by April 1945, because of what he carried from Ohrdruf. An officer who has personally witnessed the full human cost of the conflict and remains standing cannot be processed as a bureaucratic adversary. He becomes something different, a witness, and in the compressed moral space of a prisoner camp standoff. A witness who also holds 4 stars and absolute operational authority was the most consequential presence in the field. Germany accepted unconditional terms. Patton's Third Army had been operational for 9 months. It had secured more than 80,000 square miles of territory, received the surrender of over 1.25 million prisoners, and documented a record that no American army had previously achieved in terms of distance covered and engagements conducted. A combat engineer serving with the Third Army in Austria wrote to his wife on that day, "The war is over. All we can think about is, thank God, thank God." That sentence, preserved in the historical record of VE Day accounts, carries more weight than any operational statistic, because it was written by a man who had seen what Patton had seen and understood what had genuinely been brought to a close. The story of the German officer standing in the rain-soaked camp near Eisenach is, at its foundation, a story about what happens when an entire institutional worldview meets an undeniable moral reality and finds it has no response. Not because of firepower, not because of political authority alone, but because a single officer carrying a rank the Prussian honor code was compelled to recognize, walked through a gate and stated what was factually true. The Third Army moved farther and faster than any American force in the history of the conflict. But the distance that defined April 1945 was not measured in kilometers. It was measured in the seconds between a refusal and a decision, and in the centuries of military tradition that made those seconds the most consequential of the entire campaign. The German officers in Thuringia in April 1945 faced a decision their entire training had never prepared them for: a formal resolution of the conflict with an adversary who had not physically overcome them in direct engagement. If you had been standing in that prisoner compound in the rain, holding the rank and the code of a Prussian officer, what would have been the hardest part of that moment to accept? Share your perspective in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.